Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. And this program is part of that effort. Now, this is a third episode in a series of sorts dealing with deteriorating global security, with emphasis on increasing salience of nuclear weapons and entanglement of nuclear and conventional forces. In a joint statement on 10th July, Washington and Berlin indicated that beginning 2026, the United States will start quote-unquote episodic deployments of the long-range fires capabilities of its multi-domain task force in Germany, unquote. The statement also said that these deployments are part of planning for enduring stationing of these capabilities in the future. Now, notice that the statement indicates permanent nature of these deployments. Now, let me quote an excerpt at length. When fully developed, these conventional long-range fires units will include SM-6, that's the Standard Missile 6, which is manufactured by Raytheon, Tomahawk and developmental hypersonic weapons, which have significantly longer range than current land-based fires in Europe. Exercising these advanced capabilities will demonstrate the United States' commitment to NATO and its contributions to European integrated deterrence. Now, this statement has been reproduced from the White House website. And predictably, the statement was not lost on Russia, since it takes no great intelligence to figure out who would be affected by these quote-unquote long-range fires units or against whom these are being deployed. Nor has the US or Germany made any bones about the purpose of these deployments. So unsurprisingly, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has threatened to respond to any such development, and he was speaking at Russia's naval parade in St. Petersburg on 28th July, which was last month, and Putin accused the US of escalating tensions and said that Russia will take mirror measures to deploy, taking into account the actions of the United States, its satellites in Europe. Now, notice the term used, satellites in Europe and in other regions of the world. And then let me quote from what he said as translated in the English media. If the US implements such plans, we will consider ourselves free from the previously imposed unilateral moratorium on the deployment of intermediate and shorter range strike weapons, including increasing the capability of the coastal forces of our Navy. Now, this development, it doesn't take much guessing, is obviously escalatory, not just in the European theater, but overall, given that trust between and among states is not only in very short supply these days, in many cases, it is running deep deficits. Now, in addition to the ongoing Russo-Ukraine war and the consequent developments, these developments come at a time when the painstakingly built structure of bilateral arms control, verification, and confidence-building measures between the United States and Russia has been slowly unraveling over the years. And in February 2023, Russia suspended its participation in New START, which is the last remaining bilateral nuclear arms agreement between Moscow and Washington. Now, if we juxtapose this development, and we need to juxtapose this development with former US President Barack Obama's 2009 reset. As part of his reset, Obama had argued that the US and Russia should focus on common challenges, including nuclear non-proliferation, counterterrorism, and, as a matter of fact, which sounds pretty ironic today with all the sanctions against Russia, the global economic recession. Now, later that year, Obama announced that he was dropping a plan to base interceptor missiles in Poland and build a radar system in the Czech Republic, which is now Czechia. That was then. The now is shaping up very differently. While nuclear weapons are not the only problem in this now, they're becoming an escalating threat in tandem with rising distrust between states and emerging technologies whose applications and scope in some cases are not fully known. So to discuss these developments, and I know I put a lot on the table, I have with me Dr. Stephen Herzog. Dr. Herzog is professor of the practice at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. He's also academic co-chair of the Beyond Nuclear Deterrence Working Group, an initiative of the MacArthur Foundation and Harvard University's project on managing the atom. Dr. Herzog is also drafting a book, Manuscript, about multilateral nuclear arms control, and has several other ongoing projects on nuclear deterrence, proliferation, and disarmament. He's also interested in the role of emerging and disruptive technologies in international security, and previously worked at the US Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration and the Federation of American Scientists. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the program. It's a kind of longer introduction, but I just wanted to set the stage for what we're going to discuss. So let's begin with the obvious. We are no longer in a world where the post-World War II security architecture, including during the Cold War, barring some incidents, is no more there. And it's being challenged through peer competition, through, ongoing conflicts. And as the CIPRI 2024 yearbook, and I had a program on that, mentioned in, among other things, in the nuclear chapters, that the salience of nuclear weapons is increasing. I had Dr. Benjamin Zala on a previous program, and we talked about the entanglement of nuclear and conventional forces. So this picture does not look pretty. As a matter of fact, it looks pretty bleak to me. So let's begin with your thoughts on the overall security scenario globally.
So thank you very much for having me here. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad the University of Lahore is doing this series. I've had a lot of great friends and colleagues on here, and I myself have been watching the show. What I would say immediately to start off with is, generally speaking, is that I agree with you. During the peak of the Cold War, the number of nuclear weapons was increasing, and in the early to mid 80s, we hit that peak of about 70,000 nuclear weapons. And what's interesting today is that number has come down. The latest data from the Federation of American Scientists, if you believe the open sources, I think they're a pretty good estimate, is that there's about 12,100 nuclear weapons in the world held by 9 countries. But the difference here is, even though this is a massive decrease to get from 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world to 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world, we now have 9 countries that maintain nuclear arms. In addition to 9 countries that maintain nuclear arms, there are, as you mentioned, emerging and disruptive technologies that we can talk about. We can talk about cyber, we can talk about machine learning, neural networks, artificial intelligence. And in addition to that, we see strong challenges right now. We're seeing that there right now is not a bilateral nuclear arms control treaty in force between the United States and Russia. We see that China's nuclear arsenal is increasing rapidly. And among all of these different challenges, with more nuclear players, emerging technologies, we have a few different questions. And that is can these stable relationships of deterrence, which were based in the literature in the Cold War, were largely developed in this period between the mid-1940s and the mid-1960s, can they last? And are they viable? And will the players who are in the game today interact in the same ways as players have in the past?
Right. So one important thing, based on what you said, and of course we're going to talk about disruptive technologies also, is the direction of causality. As Salvador D. Madriaga said, that nations do not distrust each other because they're armed. They are armed because they distrust each other. Now, essentially, as I said in my opening also, the levels of distrust have risen sharply. And in some ways, the action-reaction pattern, if you will, is also kind of pushing the situation to a point where the actors, if you put a game theoretic sort of model on this, they are not cooperating, they are defecting, and everyone thinks that the first one to defect is going to get 5 points, and if you cooperate, you're going to get 3 points, and so you basically it's going completely against the Axelrod experimentation in terms of multiple games and multiple iterations, and to find finally that cooperation ultimately is the best possible strategy, because this is not a one-off thing. The state actors are here and they have to constantly get into situations, and if they constantly try to defect, then it's going to become a nasty game, and that seems to be the case here.
Well, what I would say is that even during the Cold War, countries had different reasons for pursuing nuclear arms control. There's a great article a few years ago, I think in 2018, by a gentleman named John Maurer, who's at Air University in the United States, called The Purposes of Arms Control. And Dr. Maurer makes this argument that when you look back at the Cold War, countries pursued arms control sometimes for stabilization of relations, sometimes because there were people who were advocating for disarmament, and other times it was because countries wanted to seek advantage. They wanted to limit specific systems that they believed that the adversary had an advantage in. So even in these kind of cooperative days, right, the objective was not always per se stabilization and disarmament. And even within national security bureaucracies themselves, you can have actors with heterogeneous interests, and even between different parties at a negotiating table, they may be seeking different things. But the mere fact that there were countries that, even though they have all these different interests and bureaucracies, they have them, that they were willing to engage in arms control, that they were willing to have these talks, provided some level of moderation. And I think that one of the interesting things is that back during the Cold War, arms control was something that was oftentimes firewalled off from the major crises, or some of the major crises actually resulted in arms control. We can draw lines between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Partial Test Ban Treaty. We can draw lines between the Able Archer Incident and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. We can even look at the fact that the negotiation of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty had taken place, but I believe its entry into force was stalled by the Soviet invasion, Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. And while that was stalled, eventually we got back there, and then SALT I came about as a result of eventual talks and changes in tensions. Today, what we see, I believe, a difference, and that is that nuclear weapons are, I believe, part and parcel of great power competition in a way that they might not have been before. There seems to be less interest in stabilizing the relationship, and nuclear weapons seem to be held hostage to overall dynamics between countries. So, for example, it's been very difficult to see anything really related to substantive nuclear arms control between the United States and Russia because of disagreements over Crimea and then Syria and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I think so long as the relationship between the United States and China looks to be hostile in East Asia, it's going to be difficult to be there. So fundamentally, I think there are two things. I think that one is when we talk about game theory, cooperation, and other things, I think you're right. I think this is kind of spinning on its axis. We're far away from the equilibrium. But then again, the other question is if these elements of arms control that game theory would tell us should work in these ways, should yield the cooperation or not, and we see unrestrained, in some respects, nuclear competition, we see more nuclear targeting, we see integration of these emerging and disruptive technologies, it also, to me, raises some questions about nuclear deterrence as a concept too, because nuclear deterrence on some level is predicated upon cooperation.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, that's a great explanation. But, and I'm just going to get to disruptive technologies also, because I think that's very important. But, you've agreed with me, and I'm happy you've agreed with me with reference to the overall environment in which things are unfolding. Now, in the case of the Cold War, for instance, since you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think that's a great incident also, and data point also in many ways. There's a level of sobriety which that incident brought on both sides. And frankly, it was sheer luck. Even when things were happening on the surface, as you know, and there was this whole debate going on within the Kennedy administration about which of the two Khrushchev letters should be responded to. And, Tommy Thompson said that, you need Khrushchev to save face. Below the surface, the Russian sub, which the US frigates and destroyers were trying to bring up to surface, the captain had decided to fire off the nuclear torpedoes. And if the executive officer had not prevailed upon him, we might have seen a completely different scenario. So it was sheer luck. But that did bring a level of sobriety into the thing. And then we had, organizations or forums like Pugwash, where both sides will whisper into each other's ears things that they could not say openly. And so there was a certain level of communication which is now almost finished as far as Russia and the United States is concerned, because of the Russian aggression into Ukraine. And then, of course, there's the peer competition with China. In the middle of all this, there are multiple technologies. For instance, artificial intelligence. You're putting it, or it's evolving, you're putting it into the kill chain. And that essentially means that now you have the capability, or an evolving capability, of actually doing things simultaneously rather than sequentially. Target acquisition is not going to come sequentially. All of it is happening simultaneously. And if you are also talking about the payload in terms of hypersonic glide vehicles, then you're obviously talking about much shorter times in terms of a response. So let's begin with the artificial intelligence thing, and then we can talk about other disruptive technologies also.
Well, I would say immediately, to get back to your question, that I like the construct that you're talking about was it luck or not? And one thing that I think is really useful to think about is percentages of risk and probabilities and other statistics. And people frequently ask me, in the construct of Russian threats and the war in Ukraine and the potential use of Russian tactical nuclear weapons, what percentage risk do you think there is attached to it? And I feel very resistant to do that, because I think a lot of that contributes to public salience and scaring people's grandmothers about nuclear weapons and things like that. But I've gathered full rooms of experts and I've said, give me a percentage. And just like out of curiosity. And what we see is that a lot of people put it at less than 1%, and others put it at 20%, 25%, which is a really unacceptably high risk of the use of nuclear weapons. I mean, 5%, even 1% is, if you think about it. And the thing about all of this is that I frequently tell people is people do dumb things. And if we think about normal humans, I'm sure that everyone knows people who have, have not worn a seatbelt in a car, or gambled too much at a casino, done other things which are really foolish. And what generally happens in life is that people do foolish things which are somewhat low probabilities of risk, and it winds up okay. Everyone knows a friend in their lives who has, for example, gone somewhere where they shouldn't have been. They've, gone traveling in a dangerous area or something like that. And then they tell you after the fact, oh, I'm okay. It's totally safe. You should do this too because nothing happened to me. And I think the difference here is the difference between doing something which is 99% safe and 99.9 and 99.99, right? is not entirely observable. It's when you start to do things over and over again in large scale data and you replicate it. So if we could imagine that you would say, for example, develop a computer program and, you know, create code replicating the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we were to run that code through, how many times does the Soviet officer on the submarine not launch nuclear weapons? Is it 9 out of 10? Is it 99 out of 100? Or is it 57 or something like that? And throughout the whole Cold War and today in these deterrence relationships, there's a whole series of events that are like that, where the probability of safety is probably pretty high, but the risk is higher than we actually think. And so that's my concern. And so when we start talking about artificial intelligence and target integration and other things, artificial intelligence actually has a number of ways to benefit the nuclear age that could be good. For example, if we're worried about a country that is, let's say, going to test nuclear weapons, we'll say North Korea, for example, going to conduct another test. Not only can you now have satellites providing this imagery, looking at their test site, you can look at certain signatures. What sort of diagnostic trailers do you need to pull up? What sort of infrastructure, et cetera? And you program in template objects. You have machine learning to help you process through all of this data. And then voila, all of a sudden, artificial intelligence is actually, right, super useful, if you think about it, for verification and for helping you identify things, for creating talks with countries saying, hey, we can see this, don't do this, because you're able to process such a large amount of data. So that's the light side of the coin. The dark side of the coin, of course, as you talked about, is if you can do that, well, then you can start looking at mobile missile garrisons. You can start doing additional tracking. And there's all the conversation, of course, about keeping a human in the loop with the decisions, not letting machines make decisions, being able to do this. And I think that that's worrisome because even though I do think that countries have made it pretty clear, they're going to keep a human in a loop with these decisions. This is the direction of artificial intelligence now. We don't know, A, where the end use is going, what reliability will look like. But B is you're adding additional probabilities of risk into an already risky equation. When the United States and the Soviet Union started developing this nuclear deterrence relationship, there were deterrence theorists on both sides of the fence who, you know, kind of had an understanding of how the sides thought. There was cooperation, there was dialogue. Now today we see, as you mentioned, less of cooperation and dialogue between the United States and Russia, the originators of this. We now see other countries, right? I don't know very much about North Korean nuclear deterrence theory, but my guess is it probably doesn't look a whole lot like people conceived in the United States and in the Soviet Union early on. There are many stories of Thomas Schelling being shocked as he learned about deterrence theory in other countries, and he just couldn't believe that people could think this, and hadn't they read his work? And so when it comes down to a lack of communication, more countries who may not conform to existing theory in the same ways, mapping deterrence theory from the 40s, 50s, 60s, which hasn't evolved all that much, onto things like artificial intelligence, it starts to get concerning. And so my fear isn't generally that I think that nuclear deterrence is unstable, we're always on the precipice of risk, these things are happening. My fear is that over time, situational dynamics have changed that make nuclear deterrence riskier. And even if deterrence has worked in the past over and over and over again, that doesn't mean you can draw a trend line, because there's always risk associated with it. And we might not have the right map or template for thinking about it.
That's a great explanation. There's another thing also, which has to do with the evolution of technology. And once again, it kind of dovetails with the current emerging technologies or the prototypes. At the very basic level, deterrence is simple and almost linear. I have the capability to punish you. You understand that you cannot take that punishment, and vice versa. So it's very, very simple, and you can talk about the counter value part of it. Then, because humans have this capability to create surplus, to innovate, to constantly invent, and we begin to go into technology demonstrators. We are constantly evolving things, and they said, "No, no, hold on, hold on. We can actually fight a nuclear war and win." And because we can now have these missiles, or we can have low yield weapons, and we can use counterforce targeting, and therefore the adversary is not going to use a counter value response to our counterforce targeting, and then you can bring in all sorts of, I mean, you are the expert here, not me. So all the flexible response and salami slicing and the rest of it. But when the situation politically, geopolitically, or in many other ways, when it deteriorates to a point where it has globally deteriorated, we're talking about two ongoing wars, Russia-Ukraine, Middle East. We're talking about nearly 50 internal conflicts, some of which are extremely ugly. Of course, we are not really talking about nuclear weapons in relation to those conflicts, those internal conflicts, but I'm just giving the sort of bleak picture of what's happening around the globe. And all of these discussions are happening, and all of these technology demonstrators and this prototyping and the rest of it is happening in the backdrop of all this, which to me then seems like a situation that is fraught and that is ripe for a number of miscalculations. As you said yourself, lots of people do stupid things. As a matter of fact, I know some people, highly intelligent people, who did like really terribly stupid things. So something like that, you sleepwalk into wars. Like World War I is a great example of that. So I want you to give me an assessment of two things. One is in terms of greater risk that you talked about right now, of things going awry. And two, any immediate possibility that you can think of which can actually begin to ameliorate the situation, at least among the great powers.
Oh boy, that is a really difficult question. I mean, you're not pulling any punches here. Well, let's start out from the beginning, where you mentioned the idea of counterforce capabilities and the idea that nuclear war can be winnable, which is a little bit scary when we start talking about counterforce capabilities, artificial intelligence, improved remote sensing revolution, and all of these different things, because as countries develop these types of capabilities, what they're fundamentally doing is they're trying to break out of mutual assured destruction. And if you try to break out of mutual assured destruction, an adversary needs to find ways to counter this, and that is contrary to arms control. But what I would say is the idea that a nuclear war can be winnable is not new. And that is that there's a whole series of people who wrote things during the Cold War about this. On the US side, we have Herman Kahn talking about his bunkers, and we're going to feed the elderly the contaminated food because they'll die of something else before they die of that. And we're talking about ways of disposing of corpses and shelters and things like that. And the whole enterprise in the United States that, my parents grew up with, of duck and cover drills, right? Like hiding under a desk, putting a bag over your head. These sorts of things are
in schools and hospitals and the rest of it. It was really funny because, Van Creveld actually wrote about this all, but go on.
But like these sorts of things are not designed to actually help you survive. What they help to do is they help to justify public confidence in the idea that it's okay to have these weapons, that a nuclear war is survivable, and maybe even it's winnable, whatever that would mean. And what's been really fascinating moving forward is that in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, where there are these moments of cooperation in the 1990s, at least in the US and the Russian side, publics seem to have forgotten about nuclear weapons and didn't really have to grapple with them. And so what I think is really interesting, and an argument that I'm making more, is I don't think that Vladimir Putin's threats in the war in Ukraine are necessarily new. We can look back throughout history and we can see dozens of these. And I'm not just talking Trump and Kim Jong-un and my red button is bigger than yours and things like this. I'm also talking about, right, we can talk about the Suez crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, and throughout history, there have just been dozens and dozens. So what I think has really happened is that Putin has said the scary bits and pieces of nuclear deterrence out loud. And so terrified publics are having to grapple with this for the first time in a long time. Some of them, newer generations for the first time, older generations again. And I think as far as nuclear deterrence goes, it's not exactly, even despite our conversation, that things are changing. It's that we're paying more attention to things. The nuclear weapons haven't gone anywhere. The elements of deterrence haven't gone anywhere, and they're still there. But the change is the context. So I am frightened by what Putin has talked about. I'm frightened by all of these prospects. And I think that for publics, when, I mentioned your grandmother being scared of nuclear weapons type of quote, this is them grappling again with nuclear salience and the world of nuclear deterrence that policymakers have decided that we choose to live in. And so whether you think that provides stability or whether you think that provides instability or it's luck or other things is an open question. As far as my overall assessment, as I told you, I still think on some level that nuclear deterrence is stable to the point that I don't see immediate nuclear crises happening, because I don't think these nuclear threats being made by Putin or Kim or Trump are new. But I think that the risks are increasing. They remain low and they're increasing. And the thing about nuclear deterrence is that fundamentally societies and publics will need to make decisions about whether this is the future they want to live in perpetuity or whatnot, because that risk has already been there and it's just escalating. And it gets worse. And there's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You said it's not that, you said that countries don't distrust each other because they're armed, right? They're armed because they distrust each other. But there's something else which is really interesting here. And that is that the architecture of nuclear deterrence says this: I have nuclear weapons, you have nuclear weapons, and we point them at each other's cities. And as a result, we have stability and we're saving lives. And there's something a little bit backwards about that logic by the fact that we've created these weapons, pointed them at population centers, and now saying that we're more safe as a result. And right now, the idea of, what can be done to make us safer, to ratchet down tensions, is a really difficult question, because as we talked about before, arms control for a long time was firewalled off. I think that we need a return to arms control between the United States and Russia, which according to the latest data have about 87% of the world's nuclear weapons. But I think that that is not going to be possible for a long time, A, because of Ukraine, and B, because of a domestic political fixation and machinations in the United States with China. And how do you incorporate China into arms control between the United States and Russia? And China has rejected the trilateral format. So I think there need to be ongoing talks between the United States and China, familiarizing each other with the language of arms control, the terminology, and what is possible. So in the background, we need risk reduction. And I think that on some level, we need a return to arms control. And I think this is all really difficult, thinking about how do we control these things? How do we get back to the good old days? And the last thing that I think we need, and I've been advocating this for a while, is I don't think, despite all the fear mongering that people have said in the media, that the war in Ukraine is going to lead to nuclear proliferation. I don't see any countries trying to leave the Nonproliferation Treaty. I think that, there's still relationships of extended nuclear deterrence and nuclear umbrellas. And I think the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty does provide benefits to some countries as far as intelligence and confidence. The thing that is worrisome to me is I don't particularly feel like today that all of the countries of the world are committed to the non-proliferation exercise that we may have seen in the past. Some of the transactions that I've seen Russia and China as far as sanctions on North Korea, sanctions on Iran. They've been willing to skirt those a little bit. I've seen countries that are willing to engage in civilian nuclear energy transactions with actors whose leaders have been out there advocating that they should eventually proliferate. So there's a number of things that need to be done across the board. It's not easy. I mean, that's just a laundry list. I mean, that's the really difficult question. How do we do this?
Well, last month, one of the leading South Korean politicians, I forget her name offhand, she put this on her Facebook, and it started a discussion in South Korea because she talked about the need for South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons capability. But anyway, leaving that aside, might I try and further complicate this? Assuming, and this can happen between nuclear dyads also, but assuming in a war like Russo-Ukraine war, where you have a nuclear weapon state and you have a non-nuclear weapon state, a non-nuclear weapon state with strategic non-nuclear weapons uses counterforce targeting and takes out an SSBN. Do you think that complicates the deterrence calculus? How is the nuclear weapon state going to respond to that, given that the non-nuclear weapon state has not used a nuclear weapon?
Okay. So
but
that
has
is
legitimately targeted an enemy asset?
I think that is an incredibly complicated question. The first thing that I'll remark on really quickly is in South Korea, which you mentioned as far as domestic proliferation, public opinion polls have said for about the past 20 years that the South Korean population, that a majority are interested in indigenous development of nuclear weapons, despite the fact that they're under the US nuclear umbrella, which goes back to the whole idea of can South Korea reprocess plutonium or whatnot. My personal opinion that I see in that is that it's very advantageous for South Korean politicians understanding the domestic political context to wave that flag. And when President Yoon in South Korea was able to get the Washington Declaration and more robust security assurances from the United States, he did it by waving the populist nuclear flag. So it's, you know, there's another whole interesting discussion about nuclear populism. Whose interest does it serve? How does it relate to security? It's something else. But what I would say is the situation that you point to is obviously scary for some reasons. And what's interesting is there are many elements of disagreement between the United States and Russia over future nuclear arms control. The United States, of course, wants to limit the entire Russian nuclear stockpile, which would include tactical nuclear weapons, where Russia maintains a massive advantage, in particular, I think, as a force equalizer to NATO, which has superior conventional capabilities in Europe. And they also want to limit a lot of these exotic systems mentioned by Vladimir Putin several years ago. Autonomous underwater drones, nuclear-powered cruise missiles of unlimited range, things like that, that I think were just bargaining chips to start with. Russia wants to limit U.S. ballistic missile defenses, which is difficult because in Washington, the idea of mutual vulnerability is now anathema, even if ballistic missile defense isn't really that good and doesn't work very well in these contexts. And the other thing Russia wants to do is they want to limit U.S. conventional prompt strike precision weapons. And that points at the issue you talked about, because these have counterforce capabilities. And so Russia has been interested in thinking about these as far as arms control. And I think that poses a new difficulty in that it requires that the future of arms control, should it happen, is probably going to also need to have a further emphasis on the integration of conventional and nuclear capabilities, which makes things incredibly more complicated. There's also another problem that we can think about too, which is logically comes from where you looked at, is dual capable systems. What if weapons are launched, which may have a conventional warhead, someone sees it coming over the horizon and thinks it's nuclear? So, I mean, I think this is a really difficult question. It is my belief that if a non-nuclear country uses conventional weapons against a nuclear country, that it is unlikely that there would be nuclear retaliation because it's not subject to the whole concerns about strategic balance. They could threaten to use nuclear weapons and escalate, ratchet up, and be more coercive. I would bet that if Ukraine would attack Russian nuclear facilities, I think we would see escalatory nuclear threats from Russia. Whether Ukraine took them seriously or not is different. I think what is more concerning on some level is countries that have nuclear capabilities conventionally armed weapons, because then I think it's part of the overall balance between the countries and can be seen in that way. So again, this is difficult, but there's a light and a dark side yet again that I would mention. And the dark side of the equation, right, is all these problems about how conventional prompt strike capabilities, precision weapons can affect the balance between countries, how they can lead to nuclear escalation when nuclear weapons weren't even used to start with, how they might prompt first use. This is concerning enough and is a way to make them limited. On the other side, people have talked about this. If these weapons are useful and allow such targeting, could these eventually, as part of a greater balance, be one of the replacements for nuclear weapons? Not so sure about that because I don't think they cause damage in the same way. But if we move towards smaller arsenals, more deliverable weapons with lower yields and counterforce type targeting rather than counter value targeting, maybe there's an area in there for potential negotiation and thinking about it. And what's interesting too is the whole future of thinking about, many people want to get rid of nuclear weapons, right? It's not, it's not an opinion of a small minority. In some countries it is, of course, but those opinions range. Those range from disarmament advocates who believe that those who work in the nuclear weapons enterprise are mass murderers and that nuclear targeting is murderous, to people who believe you could replace nuclear weapons with something like conventional prompt strike, right? And as a result of that, you just replicate these deterrence relationships with less destructive weapons. But fundamentally, and this is difficult too, is I straddle both camps. I deal with the deterrence people. I deal with the disarmament people. I have my own opinions. I think nuclear deterrence is dangerous, but I think we need to have these conversations. I think that one thing that the camps fundamentally misunderstand about each other is people who want nuclear deterrence genuinely believe in almost all cases that by having these weapons, they are preventing conflicts, they are saving people, they're helping protect their country's sovereignty, national security, etc. And then people who are on the other side of the coin who advocate disarmament believe that these weapons and risk of miscalculation and other things is either murderous, will result in great casualties. And so they believe that disarmament is actually the way to get to nuclear security, protecting their country, et cetera. And it's just a really complicated equation where people are actually seeking the same objective with radically different tools and are kind of at each other's throats on it.
Right. Before I close the program, and there's so much to discuss, but I'm very happy that you talked about the fact that with these dual-use weapon systems and platforms like missiles, you don't know whether it has a strategic warhead, whether it's a tactical warhead. This was something that I wrote and I actually discussed with Indian policymakers when India and Pakistan had this short round in 2019, February 2019. And after we had shot down the Indian pilot, the Indians had threatened a missile attack on Pakistan, which Pakistan responded to by saying, well, if you do this, then there's going to be a quid pro quo plus. And mercifully, because of international diplomacy and because of other ways and means, it did not escalate to that point. But my point at that time was that missilery is a big no between a nuclear dyad, because you really don't know whether the missile has a conventional warhead, whether it has a nuclear warhead, and you can either fail deadly or you can fail impotent. But last question with reference to these emerging technologies. Now, we have seen that technology arrangements and treaties can be very, very complicated. Take, for instance, the Wassenaar arrangement. Is technically and legally so complicated. And some of these emerging technologies, we really do not have any legal framework for them, because some of them are in the prototype stages, others are are evolving, and some are being sort of infused into the existing systems, but haven't really come online that way. How do you think, I mean, the level of complication, both technological and legal, that's going to inform these emerging technologies when some of these actually come online?
So I think that this is complicated for a number of reasons, as everything in this call and conversation is complicated, big ideas. And we like to say in the literature that there's a pacing problem between regulation and emerging technologies, that the technology has moved so fast that it is difficult for regulation to keep up with the technologies. And what's more interesting, too, is that a lot of these technologies that used to be designed by conventional defense contractors who had close relationships with national governments are now actually coming about as a result of research in startup garages and tech labs and other things, sometimes with programmers who may not be sure of the eventual end uses of the technology. So it raises very serious questions about countries' economies, also their export controls, what can be done to essentially secure these types of technologies. Do you have, designers of these emerging technologies who are willing to work for national governments in the defense industry? In the United States, we've had a lot of issues with programmers of robotics who don't want to have their products weaponized. And so I think one of the things which is difficult about all of this is when you have these end-use determinate technologies, they allow for a few different things. One is they allow for technological leapfrogging. In the competition between the United States and China, China may not need to match the United States if it can find a way to leapfrog it. The second thing is when end uses of technologies are unclear, it presents either an actuality or an illusion of first mover advantages. Yeah. And I would say that this is really difficult. How do we control technologies when we think there are first mover advantages? And there's a whole series of papers and work thinking about it. I would point to, there's some work by gentleman, Professor Justin Canfill at Carnegie Mellon University in the United States, which looks at how do you control kind of emerging anticipatory technologies with end users are indeterminate. And he suggests looking back to the things like the Environmental Modification Convention, the Seabed Convention, et cetera, when there were theoretical weapons which might have provided strong advantages to countries, and they were able to have dialogue about what it would actually be in order to limit it. And so one of the real problems here that we're seeing is the lack of cooperation as a result of strategic competition between the United States and China because of Russia and the United States, the war of Ukraine, competition between India and Pakistan, is that we don't see that type of dialogue. And we actually need to have some level of dialogue to have an understanding of what the risk of these technologies are, because people have to understand, for example, what is the risk of losing this types of arms race? What are the eventual types of consequences? And I think it's important now more than before to, one, engage the private sector and programmers in defense industry, whether that means including these technologies into your defense industry or thinking about ways to limit them and having a better idea of what the end uses and possibilities would be. And two, actual dialogue between countries. Countries in the world are going to need to have conversations about what they're willing to ship to each other as far as semiconductors, other things related to AI. They ought to be having conversations about what the potential military end uses of these things are, so we can think about getting over the pacing problem and how to make at least some sort of regulation which deals with these technologies before they come about, in order to not incentivize arms racing in the first mover problem. It's difficult because so much is unclear, and we have an unclear world as far as relations between countries.
No, absolutely. And, my issue is, and I agree with you. I mean, we got to have these conversations because that's the only way to actually deal with these complications and these complexities. But for instance, you mentioned India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan are not talking. I mean, we haven't been talking now for a few years. And that only complicates. And this is just one dyad. I don't know how much Russia and the United States are talking now. I'm sure there must be some back channels, but But the conversation is not what it used to be. Since Trump and also followed by President Biden, the conversation between China and the United States is happening, but at the same time, both sides are taking measures that actually begin to defeat the very purpose of those conversations. And so it becomes like a catch-22. But thank you so much, Stephen. I'm really grateful for your insights. Just a recap before I close this program. So essentially, this discussion informs us that states are working on developing a range of emerging technologies. And these technologies separately and in tandem with nuclear weapons give us an impending sense of unknown applications and their attendant threats. What was referred to as the entanglement of nuclear and conventional forces, or what some scholars have referred to as the third nuclear age. And then there's the development of non-nuclear strategic weapons, which could potentially target nuclear forces. I asked this question from Stephen in a counterforce strike that complicates deterrence calculations. And, if Stephen thinks that the nuclear weapon state is going to threaten the use, but not actually use it, but who knows? I mean, it could well break the nuclear taboo. And we mentioned Ukraine and Russia. So then there are, of course, the issues of hypersonic missiles, got offensive cyber capabilities, got evolving anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Just some examples of non-nuclear strategic weapon systems. And states are developing and honing these capabilities, and there are these incentives to engage in what some scholars refer to as calculated military demonstrations of their utility. And so that utility has increased. Then, of course, there's the ongoing research in the AI domain and introducing AI into a weapon system skill chain, which is already being analyzed as a major problem, especially when the system's payload consists of hypersonic missiles. So the speed of the missiles and the ability of the AI programs to align and perform various tasks simultaneously rather than sequentially mean very short bands given the distance in which a target could be acquired. And so this in turn leaves the targeted state with very little time to respond. And that could force the states into developing preemptive strike policies. And then we began with this new arrangement between the US and Germany, where beginning 2026, the United States is going to deploy certain missiles on German soil. Now, in real life terms, imagine this. How would Russia respond to this? You've got the Kaliningrad Oblast, which is the Russian exclave, which is also the headquarters of Russia's Baltic Sea Fleet. So just a cursory look at the map would tell anyone how Russian deployments would impact Poland in the south, Germany in the southwest, Lithuania in the north, and Sweden, west, and Denmark, northwest across the Baltic Sea, which already, as far as Russia is concerned, has become a NATO lake. So in March this year, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk likened the situation in Europe to pre-war 1939, and he argued that if Ukraine were defeated, nobody will feel safe. And this approach could well become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's it from this episode. If you like the discussion, give the program a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It doesn't get me any lucre, I can assure you, but certainly makes me very happy. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.